of Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was the head of Harlem's most influential church, the Abyssinian Baptist Church. These men were articulate. They had constituencies. They mobilized people regarding social protest and demands from the political system for greater rights and representation on the part of the African-American people. And Harlem was the center of this. And Harlem was also the center of a flowering of artistic and literary creativity known as the Harlem Renaissance. Poets, playwrights, authors, sculptors, others who made their mark in the field of aesthetics and in culture. So Harlem, both culturally and politically, was a site of resistance, of protest, that had a profound impact upon the African-American community throughout the United States. And into the 1950s, as other black communities surpassed Harlem in size, and here I would point to the south side of Chicago and, say, Watts and Compton and Los Angeles, and here in New York, the black community in Brooklyn and then later in Queens are in terms of their demographics, larger than Harlem. Nevertheless, Harlem still remains kind of the symbol of black urbanism for the 20th century, and for the 21st century, for that matter, because today the governor of New York was a representative from Harlem. And there's a long tradition of black political leadership in the last century here in the Northeast coming from Harlem. For example, the most influential black congressperson in Congress today, unquestionably, is Charles Rangel, who is the head of the House Ways and Means Committee. That's the economic committee in Congress, and he is the congressman from Harlem. David Patterson, the governor of New York, is an African-American. He was the state senator from Harlem. So again, Harlem assumes, even to this day in the 21st century, a political significance that outstrips virtually any other black community in the United States.
Would you say that these leaders that come to the to political positions stay true to the interests of the Harlem people?
Well, I think it would be nice if I could say that, but I think that in truth, it's much more complicated. There is a dynamic that I call the kind of paradox of integration. That is, when African Americans were legally segregated, ironically, there was a greater fidelity and responsibility that black leadership felt toward their communities, in part because all blacks, regardless of their class or their education, found themselves racially segregated. And so blacks, if you lived in an African American community, whether you were wealthy or you were poor, you probably attended a segregated school. You were a part of a church or a faith institution that was all black. Not that you excluded whites, it's that whites simply excluded you from their churches. So blacks built their own churches. That many of the stores that provided food or grocery stores were black-owned. That if you went to a barber, you went to a black person to cut your hair. If you died, you took your relative to be buried at a funeral parlor that was owned by blacks. And that segregation created an environment in which blacks had to rely on themselves to provide goods and services for themselves. Once integration occurred, all of that broke down, so that large businesses that, for the most part, were not owned by blacks entered the urban ghettos and began to absorb the market, the economic market for goods and services. And so thousands of black businesses went under. A few made it and expanded during the period of integration, but mostly they did not. And so the political economy of urban America changed. And as a result, the development of, say, black entrepreneurship was stifled and in many ways declined. So today you have central cities like Newark, where there is not a single large shopping center or a large grocery store. In a community like Harlem, where there are about 600,000 people, until very recently, until several years ago, there was not a large grocery store servicing that community. So that poor people, this is why in the United States, poor people have much higher rates of socially created deaths. So that you have malnutrition, you have diabetes, and deaths from diabetes, but you don't see those kinds of rates of illness in neighborhoods where wealthy people live, and they may only be half a mile away from extreme poverty. Take, for example, the distance between the Upper East Side of Manhattan and Spanish Harlem, which is maybe 20 city blocks. You have the wealthiest census tract in the United States is the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where wealthy whites live. And only 20 blocks away, you have one of the poorest urban sites in the United States, which is East Harlem.
Okay, and if we stay with Harlem, Malcolm X, to many a very controversial person, came out of Harlem. He lived there for many years after he came there when finishing studies. For you, he is the most influential black leader of the 20th century. Why?
I think that Malcolm came to symbolize black urbanism for a couple of reasons. His emergence in the 1950s and 60s galvanized millions of African Americans to see themselves in a different way. That he challenged white supremacy in the United States and also the power of the U.S. government. He called at the end of his life for a coalition of people of color, of Asians and Africans and black Americans, to challenge U.S. imperialism, and he took his case both to international venues where he petitioned the Organization of African Unity, as well as the United Nations, calling upon the United States to end its genocidal policies against African American people. Malcolm was the first prominent American to denounce the war in Vietnam. Years before Martin Luther King Jr., years before white American political leaders broke with the Johnson administration against the war in Vietnam, Malcolm X was challenging the administration and calling for an end to this unjust war. So in terms of his anti-imperialism, his focus against the war, and then finally Malcolm, as he left the sectarian Nation of Islam, an organization that he had been recruited to while he had been in prison. Once he left prison, he built the organization, then came to the realization that the Nation of Islam was sectarian, that it did not reflect what he would describe as true Islam, traditional Sunni Islam. He went on a Hajj to Mecca, recognizing that under true Islam was colorblind in theory. And again, sometimes not in practice, but in theory, that it recognized